Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Hopefully. My name's Eleanor Mills, and I'm your facilitator for this exciting session, Members Together on Solidarity in Action. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping very briefly. So a short visual description. I'm a white woman with freckles and dark hair. Please do all introduce yourselves in the chat and share what's interesting to you. I'll be sharing hopefully useful links, and we'll try to share all of the slides that are being shown in the meeting after the meeting. A subtitled recording of this event will be shared with delegates on the MA website soon after with the chat transcript. Please do keep your mics turned off during speaker sessions and panel discussions, but turn them on during breakout rooms, please. If your internet drops out or you need to leave and come back for whatever reason, then you can rejoin the event again with the same Zoom link and you'll be admitted via the waiting room. We follow the MA's Code of Conduct, create a safe, welcoming and inclusive space for all attendees. I'll post a link to this in a minute. We'll attempt to finish promptly at 4:30 p.m. And finally, I would like to introduce Sharon Heal. Let me spotlight you. Sharon Hill, the Director of the Museums Association and Chair of our panel today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Eleanor, and thanks to everyone who's joining us and still coming into the online room today. I'm Sharon Heal, I'm the Director of the Museums Association. As a visual description, I'm a white woman, I'm in my late 50s, I've got short blonde hair and I'm wearing glasses. So the purpose of this session is to look at what museums can do and what museum workers can do as the world around us becomes increasingly polarised. Is there anything that we can do to connect communities, to build understanding and to foster a sense of belonging? How can we support diverse communities in the UK and how can we provide a collaborative space for building coalitions of mutual support? So some of you may have been in Wales last October at St Fagan's Museum, where we had a session with the same title, Solidarity in Action, and a couple of the same speakers. But things have shifted even since then, since the elections in Wales and Scotland and the local elections in England in May. What we saw across all of those elections was that participation was down, the number of people actually voting. But for example, the reform vote was up to 17% in Scotland to 29% in Wales, and they now control 24 councils, including former Labour strongholds in Walsall and in the Midlands and in Barnsley. And they're a legitimate political entity. And I think we need to try to understand the complexity of what they represent. But again, going back to that question of what museums can do and what museum workers do. It feels like the ground is shifting on a daily basis. I was just listening to the news at lunchtime. The awful, awful murder of a young man has been hijacked for political reasons when his family explicitly said that they don't want further division in society as a result of his death. All of these things will ripple out into our communities and into our museums. We're not immune to them. We stand in solidarity, I hope, with all of our communities. So these things and much more we're going to discuss over the course of the next hour and a half. And I'm delighted to say we've got a fantastic panel to lead us through that conversation. I'll introduce them now and then hand over to the first speaker. We've got, first of all, Elaine Gurian, the museum consultant, advisor, writer and lecturer who we've spoken to many times here in the UK, online, and is a real authority on museums and the role that they play in society and on many, many other topics. She's going to update us on the US situation and outline what lessons learned there have been so far. We're then going to hear from Hannah Fox, the Executive Director of Bowes Museum, who's going to talk about her local situation and how we might face a new reality post-elections in the UK. And finally, Laura Pye, the Director of National Museums Liverpool and the Chair of the National Museum Directors Council, who's going to talk a little bit about national regional partnerships and how we might use collective sector power to support each other and learn from best practice. There'll be an opportunity to hear from all of you. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions and discuss. And one of the things we were talking about before people joined the session was interest is not enough. Pay your best attention to our brilliant speakers, but what we want to know is, what do we do? What can we do in the situation that we face? With that, I'll hand over to Elaine.
Thank you, everyone. I'm coming to you from the United States, from Virginia. I'm an 88-year-old deaf woman who wears hearing aids, and that's why I have a headset on, because it'll speak directly to my hearing aids. I'm a Jew who have immigrant parents who came from Germany, and I lived through the Second World War. Eleanor, if you would put up my slides, I'm going to talk you through a 20-minute. I'm going to go as fast as I can because I believe in being timely about what's going on in the United States without real understanding that I understand what's going on in the United States. And in fact, what I'm talking about is potentially that none of us really understand because we are so unfamiliar. Next slide, please. For most of the citizens in the US, everything is unrecognizable and unfamiliar. I'm not going to read my slides. I assume you're reading along, and I want to tell you that you can have the slide deck and use it anytime you want, and you have only to ask the Museum Association. Most of us feel at sea, as it says at the bottom. And that's because none of us understood how guardrails work, and none of us understood that they were not law and not protection. And so if you have a rogue government that takes away guardrails, there is nothing that you are equipped to do until you reorganize your head. Next slide, please. Next slide. Robert Reich, an 80-year-old German Jew like I am in the United States, go back to that slide, please, has just written an article in Substack. If you don't read Substack, Substack is the now location where people write by controlling their own writings, and almost all liberal and left-wing writers have their own Substack page. He just wrote an article called "The Language of the American Presidency Doesn't Apply to Trump." This is this week's stuff. And what he says is we have a regime and not an administration. And it caught me off guard because I realized we don't have a way of apples and oranges. If you have a regime in place, you cannot use the rules you used of an administration, but having never had in the United States a regime in place, we talk about it in terms of an administration, and therefore we are not equipped to talk to each other about what's actually going on. Next slide, please. Go back, please. Even those who have a history of resistance do not know what to do. That describes me as a complete biography, at sea and not knowing what to do. And while there are tentative shoots and there are other people who say they know what to do, my sense overall is we don't know what to do. Next slide, please. For the US museums, they are mostly keeping their head down. And what's important for you to understand, not being in the US, is that the consequences of picking up your head in a museum context now is, in fact, some loss of funding or some loss of your board trust, or there are consequences. This is not a free-for-all. And therefore, next slide, please. It may be that that's a form of bravery to keep your head down and protect your staff. And that is based on the sense that there will be a moment where this ends and there'll be a return to normal. What if there is no normal? And what if there's no return? And we in the United States are constantly now worrying about maybe there is no return here. In that case, we will need to create a new normal and new bravery. And my talk ends with 3 strategies that I hope are useful. But you have an opportunity, because collapse has not happened to you yet, to create the new normal and new bravery in advance of it, and where the consequences to your creating a substructure that in fact will be resistant has no consequences to you in the same way, and you don't have to keep your head down. And therefore, I advise you to do that now. Next slide, please. You have tools. Sharon and I have talked about this a lot. The exhibition is the most evident of your tools. I think it's the one where you're in the most danger. You have tools nobody is watching, and that's this list: organizational structure, relationship to community. That's the biggest one: your reputation, your relationship with your staff. You have tools, and all of them should be put in place for holding your system together in the terms of your values and your direction. Next slide, please. This is the plan. This is the plan. Do this, do this, do this. In order to resist, this is what has to happen. And each of these words, plan, affiliate, leverage, and rehearse, take work, and they have structure, and they take time, and they take time from your staff and all your affiliates. But in the end, this is the plan that will happen. Plan, including an emergency plan that assumes that you have a country collapse as your starting place. Affiliate is the biggest one of your assets that you need to work on the hardest. Leverage I'll talk about, and then do it over and over again. Next slide, please. Since I spoke last, this is what's going on in the world of Trump. Next slide, please. Everything is being litigated. And that's because Donald Trump uses the justice system as a halt place. He understands that he is doing illegal work, and he understands that from the beginning. And as surprised as he acts, he understands he will be stopped because our justice system is still partially working. What he wants is the time between what he starts and when he will be stopped, because he can do so much damage in that time that when he gets stopped, we will only have partially stopped him. And because there's too much to keep track of. That's known as flood the zone. And to understand the Trump regime, you have to understand how flood the zone works. It is so complicated. What he does every day is so complicated and full of distractions that you cannot pay attention to all of it at the same time. And even more importantly, you cannot organize against all of it at the same time. And you have to pick your fights. Next, please. And he intentionally has a world of trivia handy. He understands that if you start to pay attention to why he's losing the war in Iran, he can talk about the East Wing ballroom. And even more importantly, these are ones you all know about. These are so charmingly off base. Go back, please. Go back. These are so charmingly off. No, go to that one, the trivia one. They're so charmingly off base that the United States newspaper and news media is filled with this, and therefore American citizens really don't have a grip on what's going on in the world because we are paying attention to whether he's going to build a monumental art. This is intentional on his part. Next, please. This is the top part is a email he sent out, social media he sent out, in which he told us that since nobody was going to play at his 4th of July party, he was going to speak, and he was much more crowd gathering than even Elvis Presley. If you read this, and I'll leave it for you to read, you understand it is clinically delusional. The man is either clinically delusional or presents himself as clinically delusional. And a part of our being at sea is that we hospitalize delusional people, not make them president, but we don't have a route that we understand to hospitalize or at least stop him from being president. So he is working using routes that we have never seen before that use his power. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you only one example of each one of the following things that's going on. The government threatens retribution. That feels unstoppable. They are now threatening to pull customs from Sanctuary Airport. Next slide, please. The state of the U.S. is more fragile than they understand. There is an election coming in November. Whether he allows it to happen or not is at stake. There is self-inflicted wars that economically we are really fragile, but we don't understand that. And the legal system is only partially holding. There are others, of course. What you need to know is the United States of America is much more fragile than understood. Next slide, please. And therefore, the citizens look like deer in the headlights because our life is mostly the same. If you're middle class, your life is mostly the same. And we can stop watching. If you don't want to know about ballrooms, you can stop watching. And no one has figured out how to use the legal power to stop this. I mean, we know how it is, but they don't have the votes. And in order to understand what's going on and flood the zone, you have to deal with obscure detail. Next slide, please. Deeply, and this is much more difficult to understand, deeply there is a fundamental divide between the oligarch group and the working class. We understand that overtly, but what we don't understand is, for instance, why the stock market is still so okay, and how the distribution is going to keep all the upper class okay, while the working class gets poorer and poorer. We understand it is existing, but since we don't understand how it works, we also don't understand how to fix it. And there is no evidence that any governmental officials will change the laws that would cause this to be fixed. Next, please. The most surprising is the flagrant corruption. This man is stealing and lining his pockets and his cronies and his children in front of us. Here is only one example. The first 63 million for the presidential library came from the same companies that he forced to have media companies that he forced to have a settlement in the government. This was part of their settlement to give him directly cash. Next slide, please. The people are so, I don't know what, that our ability to talk to each other is also disappearing. Next slide. And here is the new part, because we're in the middle of the second and last term, or supposedly last term. We are beginning to understand that the destruction to our government may not be fixable. And here is, again, only one example. Or it may be fixable, but it will take generations. So it took, half a year to destroy. Next slide, please. So what are the strategies? Here are 3 strategies. I don't really know what the strategies are, but these are give you to contemplate. Next slide. The first one is flood the zone back, which is don't get confused, don't do everything. Next slide. Stay the course, focus on what you're doing, pick your location of effort, but encourage every interest to affiliate with each other in a big stand-up bucket. That's what No Kings is. No Kings allows all of us to show up on the same day for every issue that we care about, so that they understand there's a whole country in flux showing up to resist. This needs a whole lot of thinking through about how you flood the zone back, but that's the first one. Next slide, please. My favorite is diminished leverage. Next slide, please. The hero of that is Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada. And that one needs technically a lot of looking into, but this is what it is. We understand that if we get threatened by threats that really will harm us, we will capitulate. Let's get the threats to be blunted. Let's look at them and get them to be blunted. And that is what he has done. And he has done it by this route. And he has done it by creating a dense web of connections using what he calls variable geometry, which is not the same rules for each coalition, but building one coalition after another that takes away the threats that can happen. So if the United States had provided 90% of something, then he takes away 40% and gives it to someone else. It's technically hard to do. It requires study. It is the thing that is working the best. Next slide, please. And that's my biggest one. Affiliate, but not with only the groups you think I should affiliate with, museum sector, but everybody in your community in different ways and under different rules, and not completely and always using orthodoxy. Because the denser the web of people who will stand with you for issues they also care about, the more likely you are to be protected. Next slide, please. And here is what the consequences, which citizens are not quite used to yet. America, the United States, is about to become a second-rate country. No matter what you thought of us before, we certainly were one of the more powerful countries in the world. But here's a list of what's going on already in the United States. And when you look at France going to the nuclear umbrella from Norway, then you understand what unorthodox affiliations might look like. Next slide, please. This is the last one. The last one is just new, but it's been in my life before. In the 1940s, at the end of the war, we started to reteach civic education or citizenry, or what does democracy really mean? And next slide, please. 2 days ago, the president of a prestigious university, American University, resigned to become inside American University a fellow of an organization of 2 of the most influential councils of education, secondary education. That means to change the curriculum, to start to reteach the American citizens in college-age schools what is an informed citizenship, ethical leadership, and participation in a pluralistic democracy. What does that look like? Because their belief that if we ever come out of this, we have to have people understanding in a deep, visceral way what it means to have been a citizen, to live in ethical leadership, and to participate in a pluralistic democracy. Their fear, rightly so, is we don't know how to do that, and if we don't go back and educate that. So a president has resigned in order to begin this within the university itself. Next slide, please. This is my name. This is how you get in touch with me. I answer all by email with my phone number. If I can give you any sustenance, it would be my pleasure. That's what I know at the moment.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Lots and lots of food for thought there. It's brilliant to hear your perspectives. There will be a chance for questions and for an opportunity for people to reflect on your words and think about what that means for us here. I took a couple of, well, lots of things from it, as always, but I really got the point about understanding complexity in as much as we can using our own knowledge, our own expertise, our collections, our institutions to understand that complexity, but also operate flexibly and to build different coalitions as and when they're needed. There's much more in it than that. The slides will be available. Elaine's generously agreed to share them, and we can put them on the website with the recording of this after the event. I'm going to move now on to the next speaker, Hannah Fox, who's the Exec Director of Bowes Museum. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Sharon. So when I spoke last year about solidarity, I was talking very much around how the cultural weather was changing. And what I guess I didn't quite anticipate was how familiar that weather would become, how quickly what felt like a sort of distant pressure would settle into the everyday texture of leadership, actually, in this sector. By the time I gave that talk, political changes had already taken place in my region. Reform UK were our new local authority, and we've moved from a Lib Dem councillor to a Reform representative on our board. So over the last 3 years, some small changes that we've made or work that we've done have attracted quite a lot of criticism and a lot of scrutiny from the more right-wing press. So I guess I'm speaking from this recent perspective, really. Throughout all of this, we've been navigating how not to let ourselves get distracted by the noise or get dragged into the cogs of the machine, some of which I think Elaine definitely shared there. That's been tough to do. It's been tough to resist responding to hate speech and messages or the misinformation that's been spread about some of the decisions that we've made, work we've been doing. So we've really concentrated on ensuring that our staff feel supported and talking through decisions with them so they're clear about the truth of the matter. And ditto with our communities who come into the building, who come to our events, and who we just meet in the street. But we're also really clear that we're standing by our mission and our vision and holding our values as really vital guiding principles in the work that we do, and that these are all clearly linked back to our founding as an organisation nearly 150 years ago. And I think that long view has offered one of the most useful strategies for us. And it's helping us guide our thinking and sort of navigate things today. And I think about it from the context of what Margaret Heffernan says, the thinker and businesswoman. As she puts it, the best way to navigate uncharted territory is to have an energetic, future-facing and long-term ambition in mind. You can't build a better future until you can imagine it. And I really hold that value really true. So at the Bowes, we've been developing that and thinking about that through the lens of a strategic approach we're calling Bowes 2092. And that really orients everything that we are doing towards our 200th anniversary of opening. It's still decades away, right? Beyond me, beyond my children's careers, beyond my grandchildren's careers, actually, because my youngest child is 18 months old. And if in a good world, maybe he's retiring at that point. And it's not a prediction. I'm the first to say that we can't know what the world's going to look like, but it's a sort of orientation, a sort of compass direction. It's also a known practice called futures literacy, and it works to sort of empower us to use the future as a lens to understand the present, but move beyond that simple prediction to embrace the complexity, question the assumptions that we're making and innovate, hopefully, in the face of that uncertainty. What I've definitely found when you're thinking from this 70-year horizon, a great deal of today looks quite different. It's not smaller and it's definitely real and it really matters, but it's proportioned differently. And the question shifts from sort of how are we navigating this moment to what kind of institution do we need to be for every future community, including ones we can't imagine. And that shift in questions is more than rhetorical. It sort of changes what we're willing to prioritize, and it's giving us a language that's transcending the kind of current divides. How do we think in generations? How do we think and act boldly, even when the pressures of the moment pull us towards that sort of small and the short term? So the questions at the heart of our 2092 thinking are revolving around things like financial stability, our physical assets, environmental sustainability, the technology advances, and people, including and centering our workforce. And these aren't partisan questions. So a county councillor cares about our financial sustainability. A funder cares about community access. Our trustees care about conservation and collections. Our communities care about their local museum and engaging with our collections and their grounds and our services. And when we frame our work through that sort of long-term generational lens, we're finding ourselves in a territory that we can sort of stand together and look differently at. I don't think that's really about ignoring this moment. It's a strategic choice about where to anchor the conversation. So we're debating the decisions that we're making, not just in the present term, but we're asking what would the stonemasons of this institution do? So people who build for those who come after them, knowing they'll never see the finished thing. And that for us actually reaches right back to our founders, Josephine and John Bowes, neither of whom lived to see the museum open. But here it is, 150 years later, still going because of the decisions they made and the foundations that they laid, and their the boldness in the face of adversity. That framing is conservative with a small c in census. It's preserving and stewarding, but it's also progressive. It's building something more equitable and accessible for future generations. So I guess to build a little on that and to think about how we've been sort of responding to the here and now, the direct impact of the changes that are happening, yes, there's definitely been some for us. Not directly from politicians, although a couple of them have jumped in on the back of some of the bandwagon of things that have been said in the media. But mostly the way that it's come out is by a very small number of individuals using agenda, sort of anti-woke agenda actually, to misrepresent things and advance their own agendas. And that's been disruptive in lots of ways to our workforce, to our communities. It's been confusing and distracting, which has definitely added pressure. But a couple of years of living alongside that pressure has definitely taught me something about where that pressure is coming from. It's rarely in a direct challenge, actually, although that does happen. It's often internal. It's actually in some of the small hesitations we might make, a bit of an audit about who might object to something a decision we might be making ahead of it, or maybe softening our language in a press release. And that's some of the self-censorship that I think we've watched seep into US institutions before anything really dramatic occurred. So we're trying to stay out of that space, name it after a year of watching it and feeling it. And it really feels really important to do that. But what's helping is definitely having that framework that isn't reactive. And Bowes 2092 was developed independently of the political landscape. It's ours. It's really rooted in our story and our long-term purpose. And when that pressure comes, we don't have to improvise a defense. We can point to that. So I think speaking to this and to what Elaine was sharing, museums can and should stand for really clear values. We stand really strong on our founding principles, our vision, our mission, our values, and curiosity, openness, the dignity of every person who walks through our doors. That's not partisan, it's constitutional to who we are as a museum. What this long-term view is helping us do is articulate those values through a temporal lens rather than a political one. We're not saying we believe X because of our politics. We're saying we believe this because of what our institution needs to be across generations for everyone and what we stand for. And that's a harder position to attack. I think it's authentic and it's a truthful one to the role of museums. It's definitely a truthful one to the Bowes. And one of the Bose 2092 questions I'm sort of sitting with most is the question about people. Um, Absolutely fundamentally about our workforce, who are a community, they live and work and are participants in community life, but also about what kind of institution our future communities will need us to be. And I don't think that's a question that we can answer alone. So I think that's why this conversation matters really very strongly today. What can the national regional relationship be? What can collective sector infrastructure offer to a smaller institution navigating a politically complex local landscape? And vice versa, how are these smaller organisations who are able to be more responsive and connected to communities on their doorsteps, whatever that doorstep looks like, physical or virtual, how do they offer places of belonging and understanding about what it means to be human? And that sort of comes back to our question last year about solidarity. And I'm definitely experiencing this in all number of ways, from moments like this to calls with people on the English Civic Museums Network, to lunch with my counterparts, Sarah at Locomotion or Rhiannon at Beamish, who are dealing with similar challenges and working with community-centred approaches, to dropping into our resident bowls club on the Bowes Museum's ground for a cup of tea and a chinwag. And what I think when I can point to that sector-wide thinking and those shared frameworks and our institutions are standing alongside each other, and I get a biscuit with my tea at the bowls club, I am definitely in a much stronger position than if I were managing this alone. And I think that's probably a good note to finish on ahead of what Laura's going to share next. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Yeah, there was tons in that, and I know we shared a platform in Manchester recently as well, and discussed some of these issues with Sarah Wajid from Birmingham Museums and Kim Streets, and from Sheffield Museums, and Esme Weld from Manchester Museums. It's a very live conversation in the sector, and one that we need to dig into more. I think that thing about self-censorship and anticipatory obedience is a very live one. The fact that we're second guessing ourselves and double checking what we can say in a normal world when we would be saying those things in conversation really happily is an important point for us to be aware of, to just hold that for a moment in our heads. But also, we are working in a sector within institutions or as consultants or freelancers with a number of institutions that are built on history of topics or history of areas or history of collections. And there's something really powerful in that. There's something really powerful in us having that expertise already, of having a long back view and activating that to have a long forward view. So I think there's something about us all researching at the history of the institutions that we work in or with, but also about us as the Museums Association and other sector organisations understanding the history of the sector as a collective ecology as well. So I'm going to now hand over to Laura Pye, Director of National Museums Liverpool and Chair of National Museum Directors Council.
Thank you, Sharon. Hello, everybody. I'm still reeling slightly from what Elaine said at the beginning, and kind of got back into some positivity, because I think the situation in the US feels really difficult, and Elaine, you articulated that really clearly. And because of what you were saying and because of what Hannah said, I changed the order of what I was going to say slightly, which probably will make me sound completely disjointed now, but I'm going to try it and see. I'm coming from a position of a national museum service. Now, granted, the National Museums Liverpool is slightly different, maybe, than to some of my London-based colleagues. But I do believe that national museums and big regional museums in particular, they sit in a unique position in the UK. They have scale and they have visibility and they have convening power that perhaps some of our colleagues in smaller museums across the UK don't have in the same way. They also often hold resource and infrastructure and expertise that has been hollowed out in the rest of our industry. And that's not to say that national museums haven't had their fair share of that hollowing out as well. But, I still sit with a museum service that has a large curatorial team, that has conservators, that has experts in different subject matters, which I know many museums across the UK would give their right arm for, kind of thing. So we do have a degree of resource that is hopefully can be helpful to the rest of the sector. And we do also have a degree of profile or leadership within the sector. I am in a position where I have met with the Secretary of State for Culture on a number of occasions, and I do speak with national government on a fairly regular basis. So I just have that kind of access that often other museums don't have in the same way. And so Sharon and others were asking, what is it that kind of our nationals and our big regional museums? Because I always would say that, there's some of the best work. I mean, actually, some of the best work happening in kind of supporting communities is happening in our smaller museums across the UK. But some of our big regional museums do absolutely really groundbreaking work that is of high profile and has the things that the national museums also have access to some degree. So what is it that they can do to kind of support in this area? That, we're not just custodians of objects and stories, we are civic institutions, and we have a role to play in that, being more connected, being more resilient, and being more inclusive to our communities. So I think there's three things that kind of the museum sector can do together to kind of help in this area. One is around supporting sector capability, and that's not just delivering projects, but how do we support changes in sector capability in different areas? And I'll come back to that. One is around investment in the long term and place-based partnerships. I think all museums to some degree have this. We are long-term institutions. Many of us have very long histories. We are long-term institutions. And whilst there is really significant financial pressure on a lot of museums across the UK, a lot of us will be here in 100 years' time. So to go back to Hannah's point, we do need to think about that long term. We are long-term institutions. So how do we use that as a positive thing to build long-term partnerships and long-term kind of infrastructure? And we can also use that kind of profile and connection points to act as conveners and connectors. We can use the fact that we do have connections to different parts of communities and to government and to different things like that. We need to use that effectively. So in terms of supporting kind of capability across the sector, we are moving towards in the sector, and we've been moving towards it quite a long way, but I think we've made some real positive strides in the last 5-10 years around museums moving towards co-production. So we're not just about consulting with our communities around that, what that looks like. That is absolutely not good enough for pretty much every museum in the country at the moment. It is about co-production, and it is about talking about long-term engagement with communities and recognizing who has the power, who shapes the stories that are told, who gets to decide what museums are for. And I think there's stuff that we can do, and I think different museums have done that. So from a National Museums Liverpool point of view, we did a huge piece of work with Leicester University to create a co-production framework around how to work in co-production. And that's not to say that we are getting this perfectly right. And I spend my entire days telling people that the framework has a number of steps in it, and we're in different parts of those steps. But we are doing work around that. So we're particularly using this with the International Slavery Museum development. And how do we look at not just shaping exhibitions, but how do we look at co-producing an entire museum from what is sold in the cafe to what the building is made out of to what is on display? And those frameworks are available, and we can share those with the sector. I think if you look as well, another example of that, Manchester Museum did a fabulous job with that, with their South Asian gallery. It was co-produced it was co-curated over a number of years. They've shared that knowledge really positively with the sector, and I think that's what we all need to be doing a bit more, that sharing of that knowledge. And I was looking for an example from a different museum that I wasn't particularly as familiar with, and I came across the Your Worcester Gallery for Worcestershire Museums, and they've done some really interesting work around working with communities, including care leavers, LGBTQ plus groups, around what local people said mattered to them. And so I think sharing these great examples of co-production and how it was done, and I guess more importantly, what we got wrong and how that went badly, because I think that's the important thing. I was just in a meeting where I was telling someone, I can give you a whole list of things we've done wrong so that you can avoid those things. And I think we as museums have an opportunity to share those things as well. And the museum sector in the UK is actually quite small. So, lots of people know one another. So I think we all have a role in terms of sharing that knowledge, in terms of building capability, because that working with communities is going to be the thing that sees us move into that next step into the future and support our communities better. In terms of the kind of long-term invest in the long term and the place-based partnership stuff. I think some of our bigger regional museums and some of our national museums, we are living in a different funding landscape in some spaces, nationals more so than the big regionals. In fairness, I'm sure they'd tell me that they're living in the same funding landscape. But we do have funding relationships that we know. So I know what my funding will be, roughly speaking, for the next 3 years now, which allows us to make commitments that aren't just about really short-term projects, which I know is a huge issue for the sector. But we need to try and get back into a place where we think longer term, where we build relationships that are about the next 100 years, not about the next two. And where we start to think about who do we want to work with. So there's lots of great examples of this, because actually, if you really truly want to support your communities, you need to know them. You need to be in a relationship with them and have had those conversations. And you need to have gone through the bits where you disagree for quite a long period of time and where stuff gets difficult and we move on. So, at National Museums Liverpool, we have a number of external challenge groups that one of which we've had for 20 odd years, which is called our Respect Group, which is a community-based group around our interpretation of Black histories, and particularly works with us around the International Slavery Museum. We have an LGBTQ plus group as well that's been established for about 4 years now, and we have an access and representation group that is around kind of disability and mental health. And they are partners across Liverpool City region who have a particular expertise or specialism in those areas and act as a kind of challenge group to National Museums Liverpool. And I can assure you at times that is very challenging. There's times when that's really difficult. And, the Respect Group has been in existence 26 years now. And I have chaired Respect Group for the 8 years. I co-chair it with a community member. That's how all of our groups work. So I co-chair all of those groups with a community leader. For 8 years, I have worked with the Respect Group, and I still have times when those meetings are really difficult. But we can kind of move into those spaces, and that's learning that we need to share as well across the sector. Because I hear things in those meetings where often I will go into a meeting and someone will be really upset about something National Museums Liverpool has done that hasn't come across my radar at all, particularly, and often is a really easy fix. And often I can go, oh yeah, okay, that's fine. And in terms of supporting communities and them feeling supported, I think that's a really important part of what we do. And so building those long-term relationships is kind of really important. And I think National Museums in particular can help with that, with projects or different things that help build long-term relationships, because often they're more sustained in their funding to be able to do that. I know the Heumann as well did a really interesting project with communities in Lewisham about not just about programme, but about training opportunities and support for groups to use the museum independently, and was about sharing the space and sharing the skills and the resources. So thinking about what can we as museums do that is long term, that helps us think. And going back to Hannah's point earlier, I think sometimes when it gets tough, and the museum sector's been a tough place to work for what feels like quite a long time now. Financially, it's been quite difficult. And now we've got all of this kind of political uncertainty and this polarization of views. And when that feels quite tough, often what we do as human beings is retreat into just dealing with the here and now. And that's not helpful. We need to get back into that. We need to think longer term. As Hannah was saying, we need to be longer term about that. We need to think about longer term partnerships and working with communities for the long term, because ultimately you don't build trust in a 3-month project. You build trust over 8 years, 20 years, whatever that is. And that stuff is important to do those projects. So I think there is that thing about investing in long-term relationships that we need to do. And then I think the kind of third point for me around what museums can do and maybe what national museums can support other museums with, which was the question I was asked, that there is this thing about acting as a convener or a connector, and how do we do that? How do we make our museums spaces for collaboration that bring people together, but also how do we support one another in the sector? So if you think about the work Manchester Museum have done with their top floor, where they hire out their top floor to charities and other groups that use that space, and that means that they can convene and bring different people in and different thoughts in, and they truly use the museum as a space rather than it being used as a visitor attraction in that sense. Or if you look the work Tate did with the Tate Exchange at Tate Modern, where they brought together kind of artists and community organisations, activists, educators, to co-create a kind of programme and ideas and debate issues. That was about hosting conversations and enabling collaboration. It was about bringing people into the space. And I think we need to do that in two ways in museums. We need to do that within our spaces. We need to bring communities in and use the spaces for those discussion points. And you'll have seen, I'm sure many of you will have seen at the weekend, there was an article, I think it was in The Guardian, about the British Museum postponing their event for Jewish Heritage Month. And I think that gets really challenging, doesn't it? Because what they want to do is provide a space where those conversations can happen. And they've postponed that event because there was a credible threat that a large percentage of the people attending that event were there to disrupt rather than to debate. And they took the decision that they needed to postpone it to be able to move it into a space that they could better control. And that kind of goes back to the things Hannah was saying about, are we self-censoring there and where does that look like? We currently have an exhibition on at Walker Art Gallery called Gender Stories that was displayed at Bristol Museum and Brighton museums as well. And it's here at Walker. And we are particularly, the exhibition has toured around and it looks at different elements of gender. And in Liverpool, we're particularly looking around masculinity and what does that mean and what is the kind of history of masculinity. We look at all forms of gender, but that's the bit we're focused on. And we're doing an event that is a debate around masculinity with 3 young men from, I think they're from Bootle in Liverpool, who have never even been to the Walker. And they're going to host a conversation around masculinity, which is really exciting. But what's really quite sad about that is that'll be an invited audience event because we're not quite in this space because we don't want to get into the space that the British Museum are in where they had to postpone an event that they wanted to do. So I think we need to think at museums, how do we do that? How do we provide that space for debate with communities in a way that still feels safe for those communities to have that debate and in a way that isn't around self-censoring, because I think that is becoming an issue for the sector, and I think we do need to think about that a little. I think also the National Museums in particular, or maybe National Museum Directors Council, or the English Civic Museums Group, or those other groups that we have in the sector, we need to think about how we convene those groups together for conversations like these where we can support one another. So there's kind of 2 convening roles there. One is a public one around how do we do that in public space and make that safe and credible. And how can we do that within the sector to support ourselves to be able to do the public stuff as well? And I think there's work we can do on both of those areas that we can look at that. But then, finally, that thing about profile and how can we use it is arguably probably one of the most important probably one of the most important things that the national museums in particular do have. And I was speaking to a colleague of mine just the other day who you may have seen has written some stuff recently. So Claire Reddington, who runs Watershed in Bristol, has been very, very vocal on her views around trans inclusion, and particularly following the kind of Equalities Commission guidance that's been out. And she wrote a piece in Arts Professional, I think just yesterday, that you might be able to see, where she basically calls out leaders of national institutions for not being vocal enough in their support for our trans communities. Now, Claire's a friend of mine and I've known her a long time and I agree with a lot of what she says. And I think there's a challenge for us in the museum sector, but I do agree with her to some degree that our national museums need to be more vocal. We need to use the platform we have to support our communities more vocally. The real challenge for that is, and I agree with her, and I was having this conversation, the real challenge for that is knowing when to use your voice, because you only really get to do it once. And so knowing when to do it, I think, is the challenge. So I've been quite vocal, particularly around the trans inclusion stuff, and the issues we've had there. I currently haven't said anything about the new guidance. Now, that's not to say that I won't, because I believe that is the role of a National Museum Director. I will. I just don't think now is the time for me to say it. I think it needs to go through the House of Commons and House of Lords first, because I think there'll be some changes, and then I think will say something. But it's how do we, as national museums and big regional museums and or museums actually in any community who have a voice within their community, how do we use that voice to support one another? Is something I think we need to debate on in the sector, because I think sometimes we're quick to kind of criticize and not really understand. And I think if we could work together, we could probably work that through. And I appreciate that jumped around quite a bit, more so than I had planned it, because it was in a completely different order when I sat down at 3 o'clock. But hopefully that kind of gives an outline of what I think kind of national museums, big regional museums, or museums just generally can do to support one another, to support our communities.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laura. I was thinking actually when you came back to that point towards the end there is something about sector solidarity and sharing and doing more of that. We are a relatively small sector representative organisations, the MA, NMDC, AIM, Art Fund and others are working together, I think, much more now on advocacy, more than I've witnessed in my time in the sector. And there's definitely more that we can do. I saw Gender Stories in Bristol actually when it opened, and then I saw it in Liverpool when it opened recently. And I think it's a fantastic example of collaboration and some hard-hitting stuff in there. Brilliant, brilliant use of collections, all different types of collections, to explore that idea of gender, which, you know, can be a contested area of public narrative and conversation. So brilliant, brilliant stuff there. So we've heard from some brilliant speakers. I'm now going to do what no chair should do. I'm going to rip up the agenda, throw it in the bin. Unless people protest too much, I'm thinking we cancel the breakouts, because we've got a really good panel here. We've got a good conversation going. If people want to keep putting questions in the chat, I'll try and take some of those questions. But I think we should hold on to sort of some of the juice that we've already got and carry on the conversations, because we've heard a lot, and I think there's more that we can go at. So we'll field some questions from the chat, but we had some ideas of things that we might want to explore. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, you know, how inclusive can we be? Is it possible to be inclusive for all? So access and inclusion and equality and diversity are terms that get bandied around a lot in the sector here and in the US a lot. I assume in the US as well. But how inclusive are we, and can we be, and what are we striving for in that inclusivity? Does anybody want to have a go at that one?
So,
Yeah.
so controversially, and I've said this a few times recently, I don't think we can be for everyone. I think we can be for everyone that shares our values. But if you don't share our values as an organisation, then we're not for you. Actually, you can't come into my venue and be racist. That's just not appropriate. And so, and people push back and go, well, you know, I absolutely think we need to be spaces for contemporary debate, but that debate has to be within the lines of the law. And at the point at which it becomes racism, you're not welcome in my venue. At the point at which it becomes transphobia, you're not welcome. And so I think sometimes we get caught in museums where we go, oh, well, we have to be for everyone and all of these things. Well, no, actually, we don't. You know, we are institutions that state our values quite publicly. We have to live by them.
I agree with Laura, and let me build on it in an actionable way. You need to have terms and conditions. For us as speakers, you've raised a whole list of terms and conditions, and that was our agreement when we came here. You cannot do one without the other, and that is a piece that I would then ask every museum to start to talk about, the guidelines and the edges of their openness on the one hand. On the other hand, I think we need, as a matter of priority, to try and figure out how to heal the country. Certainly it is the biggest priority for me, re-healing. And rehealing means that within the terms and conditions of our ethics, we need to start to look at ways in which we can include people who we no longer include because of their voting pattern. There's got to be human beings within the voting for Trump sector. They are 50% currently of my country. And therefore, I think there's a very conscientious conversation we need to have about exhibition choice, about inclusion of expertise that is not politically based. I keep coming back to food and car repair and games on the computers we play, in which expertise rises without relationship to many of these other sectors. And that will make us, for the very left wing, look like wimps. And I'm voting for us to be more wimp-like, more centrist, as a way of real political extremism, because I wish us to be more inclusive to the people we are currently intentionally excluding because of their political decisions.
Yeah, and I'd finish on that. And that I think it's important as museums that we strive to try and include every person while being really honest that we can't endorse every position. And so, you know, we hold differences here without abandoning the commitments that make the museum worth coming to in the first place, and the values that, to speak to what Laura shared there, that mean that we are trusted and that we have and hold those positions really strongly and authentically and consistently, both for the safety of our community members, but also for the safety of our workforce in working in what is actually a really joyful position, a joyful role, and something that you don't come to work to be abused. So I want to make sure that that's really held strongly in our values, and we publicly say that.
I think that's the key thing, isn't it? That we can disagree.
Yeah.
Political differences in views is absolutely welcome. You know, my dad and I do not share the same political views, and yet I still welcome him into the Walker every time he wishes to come. That's fine, because he behaves within a guidance that is within the guidance. At the point at which it becomes abusive or illegal, it's no longer appropriate.
Is there a role in this then for museums facilitating, you know, that kind of public, civilized debate, discourse, which seems to have kind of been thrown into the bin along with the agenda for this meeting? It just doesn't, I don't know if that's taught in schools anymore. I don't know if that's part of the curriculum, the idea that you can disagree with somebody, but you can be in the same space and you can have a lot of the same human values. Is there a role for museums in that? Are there examples of museums doing that?
I personally think that's critical, and the way you stated it is critical, and that we do not have the tools to do what you just talked about. Before we started this, we talked about complexity, Hannah and you and I, before Laura came here, so let me fill you in, Laura. I think that the whole exhibition exercise has avoided the notion that we don't have to have a conclusion that's unanimous, that you can look at a range of outcomes for yourself, that you can use an exhibition in different ways for yourself, that we need to underscore so that people come to the museum and leave the museum peaceably, but use the exhibition for their own needs differently, so that we physically stand together doing different things without killing each other. We don't care that people who are car aficionados are doing something different when looking at the car than we are, because it's not threatening us. And I think we need to teach our visitors and teach ourselves how you do that, so that we become a venue for broader ideas simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the world is complex, right? It's non-linear. So, you know, the more that we're representative of the fact that there is complexity in the world, and we can see this in our collections, we can see this in the way even our museums have been founded, and that we talk about that openly and we hold space for complexity, the better, really, to exercise that muscle that Elaine's talking about in terms of education. And to the point, I think there that is it Rhiannon's added that, universities are starting to include how to disagree well. It's like, yeah, because the world is complex and we don't all agree. So like, how do we learn and understand how to navigate that and not be in a polarizing position continually?
I think sometimes museums can do that so we've got gender stories on at the moment, but we also open John O'Comfort, which is kind of in the same, they're in very similar spaces. So they're next door to one another. And we opened John O'Comfort one night and then we opened Gender Stories the next. And one of our patrons had very publicly told me that she wasn't coming to Gender Stories because she disagreed. She hadn't seen the exhibition. She disagreed with the things that we were discussing. I mean, how she knew what we were discussing was beyond me, but there we are. So I had gone, right, okay, but she came to John O'Comfort, and because it's kind of in the same space, her and I were having a conversation outside, and I was like, it was open. I was like, you could just go in. And she was like, I don't think I'll like it. And I was like, well, you never know. Anyway, I found her about 40 minutes later in Gender Stories, and her views, she hadn't changed her views. She still has some particular views that I would strongly disagree with. But she had engaged with the exhibition because she felt in a safe space, because it's a space she knows really well. She'd come for another thing. So it wasn't like she'd come to see that exhibition. And and museums can do that. That's quite useful.
Absolutely.
100%.
And you can do it intentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can do it by making the barrier between the lobby and the exhibition much easier to navigate. You can do it by inviting people to eat your food without having to think that they're going to the museum, and then, oh, by the way, they go to the museum. And none of those things happen without your intentionality. So I've spent a lifetime trying to figure out the roots that do these things that get you into Gender Stories by accident, and where you can deny ability when you go home. I was on the way to the loo, you can say, in which you then engage with other things. And that does not happen without working on it, looking at the floor plan. It's a technical thing to do.
I'm keeping an eye on the questions in the chat, and I am going to try and summarize them and give them to the panel. So please do keep questions coming in the chat for the time that we've got. Just a question on skills, actually, and expertise within the sector. If we are going to be porous organisations that put those different types of exhibitions and experiences on, that draw in different communities and those that don't normally visit, have our staff got the skills, and it is a skill, to talk to people? Quite often our front of house staff do, but our other staff. And is that something that needs to be, is that something that we need to be discussing, how we engage in those civilized conversations and how we get our staff to engage in those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I'd say in terms of skills for the future is how do you build relationships and networks? So like, how do you genuinely enable, or how are you able to build that conversation with someone who might not agree with you, in order to be able to make a connection wherever that connection is, in order to then find that point of reference to then build out a conversation? Because otherwise, if you're starting from that framing of continually, you are polarized different to me, of course, safely, but within the context of like, how do you start a conversation with someone, build that conversation out to make connection with them, to understand, and then to develop that conversation more fully into something that can safely debate and explore some difficult, challenging questions potentially, but in a space that enables you to have made that point of connection. And I think that's something that we need to flex more around our muscles generally. And I think that has to not just be in the point of the front of house or in the learning teams. That has to be everybody. It has to be everyone has a role to play in making connection and having conversations with communities and our audiences. I think also collaboration is critical. So I think being able to think collaboratively around something to the point of difference as well is an interesting thing. And I think also that emergent mindset, the thing I keep coming back to is like, how do you have an emergent mindset that understands that change is constant? The world is always changing. So how do I need to, as an individual, flex and understand that change rather than resisting continually? How do I need to understand that and flex and adapt my approach to that world as it is shifting and changing because it is complex and nonlinear.
And is there enough interaction between, the front of house and other staff? Are we having those conversations internally? It's a small example, but I was struck recently at the opening of the Museum of Homelessness new summer exhibition. I was wondering, and it's mainly outside of the grounds in the grounds of the museum. And one of the community members who we've worked with for a long time, who didn't recognise me, I'm the chair of the museum, came up to me and said, "Do you know what this is all about? Let me tell you about how we built the pond and why we've got all this outside of here." And I just thought that really spoke to how that museum operates, but the potential for how we operate in terms of staff and how we interact together and and who's given the opportunity to have those conversations with communities. Sorry, Elaine, did you want to come in on that point as well?
I do. I want to make 2 points. One, the one that Laura is talking about guidelines. We are not for everyone, because we have guidelines on both sides here. How you build guidelines within a museum is a task the museum does not have itself necessarily, and is one that you could help with. It's a skill set which gets written down that everybody can make commitment to before they enter. And the other one, which is how you build affiliations, or how you do the thing that I talked about, which is to figure out where leverage is not something the museums know how to do and needs an outside guider. I am thinking, for instance, one of the takeaways is, if a single museum gets attacked by a single person, even if they're in the region, is there a system by which that person is not left alone? That person is not on their own. The decision they make will not be on their own, because political leverage needs to be pre-organized. That is not something the museums can do completely by themselves. So many of the things that we're talking about are, in fact, tasks, not just good ideas. And the tasks themselves are not within generally the museum purview and need somebody in there.
And I think the other thing that we're getting better at as a sector, but we're not as great on, is not just the skills in engaging in the conversation, but creating the environment in which the conversation can happen with those communities. So, I very rarely hold I don't think I've ever held an in-person meeting with my respect group that didn't involve food of some description, because it just wouldn't happen in that they wouldn't probably come. I remember the first, I've never been so embarrassed in my entire life. The first 2 meetings we had of our access and representation group, in the first meeting, we had quite a large percentage of people who were blind in the room. And the presentation we gave was very, very visual. And I was sat there thinking, well, this is awkward, because then we're trying to have to visually describe, we're trying to describe a presentation that's really visual. And then the next presentation, for some reason, those people couldn't make it. They're part of the group, but they weren't there at that time. And we had we had 3 people with us who were deaf. And we gave a presentation that had no visuals at all. That was just a verbal presentation. And I was sat there thinking, well, this is awkward, because we've had 2 of these meetings so far and we've got it wrong for our audience on both counts. And thinking about that kind of open, or we've got much better at knowing when we're going into that room that we're presenting to a mix of different access needs, and we need to meet those access needs. I think sometimes museums need some support in just thinking that bit through, because you don't even get to the conversation if the person doesn't have a signer and is deaf and can't therefore communicate with you. That just doesn't work.
Yeah, I just moving the conversation on a little bit, because people will be thinking about this, and you alluded to it, Hannah. about sticking to your mission, vision, and values when working with politicians of all stripes, because there have been changes. And, even if it's not the party that's in power, there are shadows in Wales and Scotland who will be looking at the cultural sector. Reform in Wales had a whole page on culture and museums and very specific views. So how do we stick to that mission, vision, and values, but also acknowledge that you've got some people that a political constituency here that we need to engage and work with? What's some practical ways of doing that?
I know you've probably had more experience.
Yeah, I think so we redid our vision, mission and values three years ago. And so our vision is to unlock people's ability to shape a more interesting, equitable, and sustainable world. And we do this through as a future-thinking museum of artists, designers, and makers, and through a spirit of generosity and collaboration, we uplift the region. So we're really clear on what that means. And I think they're not political opinions. So I think the framing of it is our mission, vision, and values aren't political opinions. They're the conditions under which the institution is doing its job across time. So I think that sense of like it was founded to do that. It's doing it now. It's intending to do that in the future. And the words and the way that we might express it might have changed, but ultimately it's doing what it was originally founded to do. And what we're doing is framing it within the context of which we're looking forwards at this world right now. And that thinking long, again, I think coming back to what I was sharing sort of helps. I can invite any elected representative into a conversation about what this institution needs to look like for our grandchildren's children. That's not a politically charged question, or at least it shouldn't be. When we sort of lead from that horizon, we're sort of less likely to find ourselves in this reactive argument about those individual decisions and more likely to have a conversation that most people can sort of genuinely engage with. And if people have a big, reaction to that vision and mission, they can come and talk to me about it, but no one has. So it's an open door. Like, here's what we stand for. Here's who we are. This is what we were founded on. Here's what we intended to do. And here's how we do this. We do this as an Arts Council National Portfolio Organisation. We do this as an organisation that's in its community. We do this as a regional anchor. This is what we do. And I think it sort of speaks for itself too. So they are anchors, and they are, as I said, sort of conditions under which the institution does its job over time.
I think as well, museums are quite broad institutions, aren't we?
Yeah.
We have loads of stuff going on. So, and I think probably everyone on this call has had experience of where you've worked with a political leader or a funder or whatever who you don't personally share the same values as, but you can normally find a connection point, can't you? So, you can talk about your school's work, or you can talk about preservation of heritage, or you can talk about the work around well-being and all of those kind of things. So generally speaking, and I'm fortunate that I run 7 museums that are very different. So generally speaking, regardless of anybody's kind of political views or personal motivations, I can normally find a discussion point around something that the museum's doing that those people would be engaged with and positive about. So I think on the whole, that's probably fine. Having said that, we are reopening the International Slavery Museum in 2029. And if this government goes as far as it can do, that will be a few months after the next general election. And the thought of that absolutely terrifies me.
And I suppose that speaks to your point, Elaine, about kind of learning from what's happened in America and planning ahead.
Well, one of the things that politically pressure on our museums has to do with the relative proportions of bad news, for example. And as I entered the museum world 60 years ago, triumphalism was the historical perspective of the great and glorious George Washington, and we didn't hear about his slaves. So the percentage of what is now going on is not the, oh my God, it's about a specific thing. It's about, do you love America? Do you care about what your role is in terms of building citizenry? The argument is not specific. The argument is about what it is to make people feel guilty, how it is you are going to present information that makes us look good. And I don't think anybody is going to be immune from this. The pre-organizing, we have many examples of where, and that's what's going on now in the United States Museum, where you write labels that have no judgment. That's the way you pre-censor. And that's also the way you protect your museum. Is that pre-censoring brave? At the moment, I believe it's brave depending on how it's done or how code word or what wiggle words are in. So I don't want people to think they have an either or choice. It's going to be much more difficult to choose. And the choice is going to be within museum practice itself, because museum practice has examples in every single generation that has done this. So workshops about voice in a generalized sense then turns out to be useful. Or what is significantly compromised and what isn't turns out to be useful, because these are all gradation decisions that you're going to be asked to be made.
There's a question and a couple of points about resistance and disaster planning. Some communities that may feel that they will be on the sharp end uh, of what some organisations may be advocating at the moment. And I'm just interested in sort of exploring that point a little further in terms of the push and pull of resistance and how much we can do in the spaces in which we operate in museums. Hannah, we spoke earlier about maybe it's not resistance, but maybe it's just a reaction. The example in Durham recently. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, so this was you may have seen in the newspaper that the local authority took away the small amount of funding that it was giving Durham Pride. And the response to that is that the trade unions have got involved and basically through fundraising and support have then put on a bigger, better, more funded Pride that's just happened. And to me, that just is such an incredible example of community coming out and showing up, and that community includes people who have voted for that council that will have but don't stand by that decision. So that there is a lot of hope in that, I think, in terms of people's ability to stand up and resist and come together and collaborate and say, actually, no, this is really important to us. This represents who we are. We align with these values as individuals and as a community of mining communities. This is what something we align to, and we want to support it. So let's go for it, and then making it happen. So I think it's a beautiful example, really.
Hmm. I was really cheered when I read about that example, and it also made me think, can museums step into that void? Because, like you say, it was a tiny amount of funding that was being put into the local Pride anyway. Museums have been really good at holding Pride as a day, as a march, as a protest, as a celebration, as an event, as a whole month-long exploration of LGBTQ plus history. If that happens, is that a practical thing? If that happens elsewhere, and it surely will, can museums be the host, the facilitator, the fundraiser, the ones that step into those spaces? Because we have to kind of think about some of the
And
positive practical
And I
things we
think
can
we
do in those
are.
spaces.
I think we
Yeah.
are doing that a lot. I think there's a
Mm,
lot of examples of that practice. But I think what's really powerful in this is the collaboration element of it. So that sense of
mm,
like, to speak to Laura's point earlier when she was talking around who can do that step forward, who has the strength of voice and platform in order to be able to do the initial convening and step out for that, and how do others come around that. So I think that's the kind of, how do you provide a little bit of air cover, which we've been talking about recently actually in other groups, of like that momentum gives safety in numbers and gives a space to do that. But I'm seeing museums standing up and putting these out and putting amazing stories out for the breadth of our communities, and with the breadth of our communities in collaboration with them all the time, and doing that quietly too, and that's fine. Like doing it
mm.
quiet resistance is as important as loud resistance, in my view.
completely. We're coming into the last 5 minutes, so I'm going to come back to panel members for take homes or take back to your institution or take back to the institutions that you work with. Because one of the things that Elaine has said is, it can't just be that we're interested in this topic. We've turned up today, we've put an interesting, hopefully, panel and conversation together. It's not enough to be interested. It's about what we do next and what we do now. And we've heard great examples, positive examples of what museums at scale, all different types of museums are doing. But it'd be good to kind of round up on some of the things that we can do now. Certainly as the Museums Association, we're committed to, and it sounds mealy-mouthed, carrying on this conversation, but providing those opportunities, platforms, conversations, events where we can discuss and share, where we can think about the quiet acts of resistance and share them amongst ourselves, as well as the platforms that we need to stand on where we've got powerful voices at the right moments. So what are the things that you would want the people who've turned up to today to take home or back into their institutions?
I would ask everybody to do something. And the something to do is a piece of work. So that means you have to take it out of time of other work. I don't believe in add-on work. That it becomes a part of the curriculum of your own internal museum, and that the something you do is the next step for wherever you are. Certainly we've had some examples of the next thing you can do. My two favorite is build the terms and conditions that you want to propose about your values. And the other is build overt collaborations that have in them a phone tree. If I get called to do this, we will convene and we will all talk about it before I answer. That's the one where you are prepared in advance of the phone call you didn't see coming. But don't go away from this and do nothing. And don't go away from this and only do something that's about your personal view. Look at your institution and take your institution to do something next.
Thanks, Elaine. Laura?
I think the one thing that I'm taking away is I was really struck when Elaine said earlier around the No Kings protest being about bringing people together. And I think it was Hannah talked about how do we give one another air cover, how do we in some ways protect one another. And I think those two things are slightly linked, aren't they? I think sometimes in the museum sector, we get caught into a space where we're attacking one another for the things we all believe, when actually we're not the enemy. Let's focus on the bigger enemy, let's focus. And actually that the No Kings protests are quite interesting. I'd never really thought of it in that way until you made that point, Elaine, that like, it doesn't matter what the individual interest is. It's against a common kind of enemy in that sense. And I think sometimes in the museum sector, we're quite critical of one another for not being outspoken enough or not doing something or not. And actually, we all agree with one another, like in lots of ways, we're in the same space. Actually, we'd be better joining together.
Hannah?
Yeah, I'm gonna just like double click on that. I think, how do we do that in collaboration? I think also community relationships built in advance, like trust that exists before the pressure arrives, are the most valuable asset that you can have. You cannot build trust during a crisis. So we've had like superb support from people in our community, including our stakeholders, and that's because we've invested in those relationships and personally been invested in those relationships. So that's super, super important. And I think the last thing I think is, this work is just hard work, right? So take care of yourselves. I'd just say that. Take care of yourselves and make sure that you're taking care of yourselves too.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much. So building sustained long-term community partnerships that have longevity and will be the foundations of all that we do in the future. And we are on the same page. So let's live the solidarity and the support that we can give each other. Thank you so much to an amazing panel. Thank you to all our delegates for staying with us. And thank you to Museums Association staff for supporting today. A lot of this will be on the website afterwards. It'll be available to delegates and we'll carry on the conversation and the action after this meeting. Thank you.